We're about to bring on stage our keynote speaker. And I wanted to actually introduce her in this way. You know how, like, in every newsroom, there's always that editor that every reporter is angling to work for. Like, in every newsroom I've ever been in, there's always that editor that us reporters talk about, we whisper about, we talk about over beers, we talk about over lunch. We're like, that's the editor that I want to work for. It's a combination. Like, they're great journalists, but they're also great people. They're the kind of editor, there are editors who are always looking to say no. These are the editors who are always looking to say yes. They're the editors who are always asking, why is it taking so long? When are you going to get me that story? And there are other editors who are saying, actually, you should slow down. You should take a little bit more time to understand this. Those are the editors that reporters are constantly drawn to. And when I worked at the New York Times, the one editor that reporters constantly talked about wanting to work for, craving to work for, was Susan Chira. Susan Chira has basically done and edited everything there is to do and edit in journalism. She's been a Metro editor, she's been a Metro reporter, she's been a foreign editor, she's been a foreign correspondent, she's been the managing editor and the deputy executive editor at the New York Times, and now at the Marshall Project, she's the editor-in-chief. And when you talk to Marshall Project reporters, and I think there might even be a few of them here, yes, there they are, they rave about what it means to work for Susan Chira. They talk about someone who is a fabulous mentor, who has a big heart. Abby Van Sickle, who used to work for her and now covers the Supreme Court at the New York Times, says that Susan leads with grace, grit, and quiet determination. And that is why I thought, wow, this is someone who, at the Marshall Project, and maybe building off of the panel that we just heard from, the Marshall Project, since Susan has come on board, not only have they opened up a new bureau in Cleveland, they're now in Mississippi, and rumor has it that they're about to announce opening yet another bureau in another Midwestern city. And so in this moment when we've heard about places like the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, which, by the way, was one of my first newspapers, shrinking to almost nothing, she has been leading at the Marshall Project and growing and building this incredible staff that is doing amazing work. They did an incredible project last year on the New York State prison system, which I urge you all to read, and the impunity that occurs within the New York State prison system. And so I just felt like, wow, Susan Chira is exactly the person that I think this community needs to hear from right now, today. And so, Susan, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here to the Logan Symposium.
Wow, okay. So, David, I'm going to return the compliment and say, David is the kind of reporter that everyone wanted to work with, and we know why. And David has put together a conference that I think has unerringly focused on both the crisis that we face and the things that may yet save us. And so I was very honored to be asked. This is an incredible powerhouse group of people. And I want to say that I'm just so happy to be in a room with journalists who talk about journalism, because that's what keeps us all going. And I've had 40 years in the business now, and when there's economic peril looming or the burden of bearing witness to horrors abroad and at home seemed unbearable, digging into a story has always provided equal parts distraction and satisfaction. That's why we're here. And it's sort of how can we get to keep doing it, and who can we get to listen to it and hear it? So we're at one of these junctures now, right? When our profession seems like a battlefield littered with corpses. And it's not an exaggeration to say that. We've all heard. And even more seriously, the very worth of facts and truth is under relentless assault. There is a systematic, determined attempt to undermine belief in what we do and to undermine the idea that there are incontrovertible facts, right? So I want to talk today about why we have to stay, why the work we do is more urgent than any time in my living memory, and I think I'm older than many people in this room, not everybody, and how can we stay resolute and productive in troubled times? It is really easy to succumb to despair. You think, I'm doing all this work and nobody cares. Does it in fact change minds? Is it taken in only by the converted? Is anyone paying attention? And can we afford to stay in it, right? Is there going to be a viable way to make a living out of this? Because very few of us can do this without the means to make a living. So this conference has been impeccably organized, and so I'm actually gonna skate through some things that I now realize I don't need to expand upon. And so very quickly, all right, we know what we're facing: an economic implosion in newsrooms, the collapse, except for a few behemoths, of a for-profit model, which has meant the absolute decimation of local journalism and the crippling of many national outlets. And as everyone has said here, that crippling of local outlets is particularly threatening because that's how the community figures out what's going on. And with no one to watch, when we, the Marshall Project, trying to do our small bit here, conducted a study in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, as you know, we focus on the criminal justice system. What do you need? And I talked to this one judge who was, very aware of many of the systemic problems that community faced and their court system faced. And he said, well, 10 years ago, the Plain Dealer had a whole series of beats about criminal justice, and they had several people assigned to the courtroom, and then they had a summer intern coming in the summers to write about the courtroom, and then there was nobody. And this guy said, and we all know sources have their own motive. He said, when I would try to prod my fellow judges to change something, and I would go talk to a reporter, and then it would be exposed, and there was more process. I can't even do that. I've got nowhere to even go to try to get change and drive change. So we all know that, and not only is local news the biggest loser in this implosion in the landscape, but local is a place that we all know where impact can be most direct, most forceful. It is much harder to ignore what the people in your community see in their local outlet. And when we look at trust in journalism, we see that trust is higher for local institutions than for national institutions. So, that's a terrible thing. You saw in this panel, and nonprofits are a very important part of the answer, but they also face a very uncertain future. As you've heard about funding, and I'm not going to make a plug, but it's very, here we are at the Marshall Project. We're not going to get a lot of sponsors for our work about the horrors of the criminal justice system. There's not going to be a lot of people who want to, have their names associated with what we report about. So we don't have, we've got a philanthropic model. And that is because it is really hard to find people who want to be actually, having a booth at a live event, where we talk about relentlessly depressing things. And I will say that we are also in a moment where not only is the for-profit model under relentless siege, but we are seeing pullbacks in philanthropic support in many ways. The criminal justice, by the way, was a thing, and it's not as much of a thing. And, we have seen some really esteemed and fantastic nonprofit outlets go under or close to under. So we see that too. We obviously have the really big problem of finding audience with the implosion of social media, the toxicity, and we have this point that I talked about rejection of facts and the siloing of the news audience into ideologically driven outlets and ideologically driven camps. And then we also have the weaponization against journalism because we still unsettle people who are powerful. And I don't have to remind you of Peter Thiel and Gawker, or that Mississippi Today, a fantastic outlet that exposed the pay-for-play issues with Brett Favre and others. The governor is suing them for defamation. So we are watching a very concerted attempt, and we'll talk more about this later, but it's a classic authoritarian playbook to go after financially and reputationally the press. So political outlet attacks on journalism and politicians who lie with impunity and partisan polarization undermine trust in facts. And one of the things I did was try to talk to some people about why this works. And it's very interesting. Misinformation is emotionally very satisfying to people who dish it out and receive it. One of the things that scholars of this has found is that people circulate what they already believe, and it gives them an emotional satisfaction being a community of people who believe those things, and it's a way of affirming their membership in the community, and they like to feel that they're right. So they cherry pick what it is that makes them feel that they're right. And the other challenge for us as journalists that we've always faced is that people don't like to have their views challenged. They don't like to be told that what they think is true may not be, or someone they believed to be honorable is not. So, okay, we have this bleak landscape. We all know it really well. But don't forget that everyone in this room is producing accountability journalism of ambition and impact. And so we cannot stop. We will not stop. And we have to share ideas, as we've done here, about how to fight these debilitating trends, even though progress is uneven and halting, because I'm here to rally, but I'm also here to be a realist. So this whole 2 days have been about some tactics that I've experienced since my transition from the world of, for-profit to nonprofit journalism, but is shared no matter what your model is. And you just saw a panel about new nonprofits and their impact. So let's see. Now I'm going to get the clicker right, I hope. That was this. And I'm just going to point out a few more examples because I think you can't talk enough about great journalism. And one of the things that I think you saw in this panel, but I also think is really important, is we really have cropping up in tiny ways, in tiny places that are red as well as blue, some amazing journalism. So the Flatwater Free Press, this is kind of a montage, but the Flatwater Free Press, which is 2 or 3 years old, is a remarkable, let me just make sure, whoops, there it is. Okay, this is a pretty small, it has 5 full-time reporters and a few contributors. It's based in Nebraska, and it has rocked the state. This Dirty Water series was a really fascinating thing. It investigated elevated nitrite levels in drinking water, okay? A lot of pig farming in Nebraska. And this Our Dirty Water was a remarkable investigation that resulted in introduction of bills. It had 4 bipartisan legislative bills. It actually drove a lot of money to looking into this. And one little footnote that I didn't put on the slide, but the reporter who investigated this was a Chinese-American reporter, and the governor attacked her for her ethnicity. And one of the remarkable things that happened is that she had spent so much time in the community that she was getting rallying cries of support from Republicans and Democrats alike because they trusted her. Now, the reason the governor attacked her is that one of the nitrite producing was on the governor's massive pig farm. So, you know, this is a small band of people doing kick-ass work. New Mexico in Depth. That has 3 full-time and 2 contributing reporters. They did an investigative series called Blind Drunk. And after that, the New Mexico legislature raised the state's alcohol tax for the first time in 30 years, and it's projected to raise $10 million a year for alcohol treatment, right? Next is Documented in New York City. Many of you may know it. It's a remarkable institution, and it established a wage theft monitor. It's the largest public repository of data in New York businesses found guilty of wage theft. And it was a 5-year effort by Documenter, and they also did lots of guides because their audience are immigrants, and to explain how you can act and where you can go if you feel that your wages have been stolen from you. And it inspired New York lawmakers to propose legislation to strip violators of the ability to conduct business in the state. So this is just obviously one of many, but I like to focus on really tiny in places that we don't always think of as being receptive to these efforts. So obviously, this is one great weapon. Then we have, I just want to make sure, the theme is collaboration, right? We cannot, you know, I grew up too in this cutthroat environment where you compete, and I love, love, love that what we are understanding is that we have to band together to have impact, to share resources, and to make sure that great journalism thrives. So, you know, these are a number of different places, some Marshall Project, some others, that I just wanted to highlight as examples of the way that this is not about distribution, this is about co-reporting. And I think that's very important because one of the things that, you know, big national outlets are often accused of is the sort of local toe touch, where you go in and you don't really know the locality. But if you combine local source expertise with the kind of assets and resources that national organizations often have, data analysis, you know, visual presentation, data visualization, audience resources, skilled investigative editors, support for public records request, legal help. And if you put these together, you can do amazing work that has impact in the place, but also highlights a problem that is resonant around the country. So, you know, these are just a few of some of the things that we did, but I wanted to highlight them. So, as David mentioned, we have a bureau in Cleveland. Cleveland, right next to Cleveland, is a very wealthy white suburb called Bracknell. Cleveland is a predominantly black and brown city. And so, for years, everybody knew that if you took a shortcut through Bracknell, and, you know, Wesley can correct me, but you took a shortcut through Bracknell, and you were a black driver, you were going to get a ticket, you know? And that was known, but it wasn't proved. So our reporter there, who was a very seasoned investigative reporter, started collecting all the tickets that were issued. And what's really interesting is it was actually really hard to prove that because race wasn't routinely recorded on the tickets. So we had to put together partly proxies, like who lived in Cleveland and who lived in Bracknell, and like, guess what? Like, I'm gonna boggle the number, but I mean, a vast, vast, vast majority of the tickets were not given to anyone who lived in Bracknell. They were given to Clevelanders. So even, you know, even before the investigation was published, because we were bringing the results to the police department and the mayor, they started to drop the number of tickets issued. And then 2 required ticketing officers to record race. And then a year later we looked, And every traffic stop was indeed including race, but it wasn't getting a hell of a lot better, but it was a little bit better. And so I also wanted to mention that, so that's an example of one model of how you can co-report. A national outlet puts some reporters on the ground and they work for that outlet. Another example is, well, so this is the Marshall Problem. Cleveland, I wanted to talk about another model that you all know, the ProPublica Local Reporting Network. They will sponsor for a year or two a reporter in a local newsroom and help them do an extraordinary investigation of the kind that ProPublica is famous for. This is an amazing one that happened to win a Pulitzer Prize. This was about sexual abuse and harassment in Alaska with no cops investigating, and once ProPublica drove in, you know, this changed. But they did it with local reporters and their own national expertise. And ProPublica has announced that it is planning to publish local investigations in all 50 states over the next few years. Another model that is interesting is the New York Times Fellowship. So Dean Baquet, who many of you know, he lives and breathes investigative reporting. It's his greatest joy in life. When he stepped down as executive editor, he decided that he would, you know, work with the Times to fund investigative reporting fellowships in localities. And as many of you know, this remarkable investigation resulted with Jerry Mitchell as a partner, who is the dean of investigative reporters in Mississippi, and of course, Alyssa and Brian and a whole bunch of other amazing people to do this great investigation, which had results because they already have prompted state legislatures to propose new restraints on this utter impunity. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of co-reporting, not necessarily as a fellowship and not necessarily establishing a news team, but when you know that a local reporter will be able to track this, but you have a national idea. So this is something that we did at the Marshall Project that I'm really proud of that we're continuing to do. In a post-Dobbs landscape, we were like, look, our lane is the criminal justice system. So are people going to be prosecuting pregnant women for having abortions or for general issues? How are we going to know? Because there are individual decisions being made all across the country by individual prosecutors and sheriffs. So we basically reached out, and Carrie Aspinwall is in the audience, big shout out, and Joe Neff, who did the great impunity, well, I'll talk about it in a minute, but the great investigation into prison guards in New York with his colleague. But Carrie and a bunch of us reached out to 5 different local entities to say, hey, we want to know who's being prosecuted. Keep an eye, and let's see what stories we get out of it. And so we did this fantastic series that we're continuing on the criminalization of pregnancy. This particular one that we wrote about was prosecuting pregnant women who used medical marijuana, other legally prescribed methods, but they were prosecuted for child abuse or for, you know, drug use. And after this story ran, well, sorry, that's the next one. I'm going to go back for a minute. After that story ran, at least one Oklahoma police department stopped forwarding such cases for prosecution. We're determined to continue this reporting, and we could never do it without our local partners. They know and we don't. So I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people could do, you know, a combination and leveraging up their skills. Another thing that we are working on at the Marshall Project, which is also happening other places, is something we're calling Investigate This. And this is basically an attempt to help localities and local newsrooms figure out how to investigate certain things that we've learned how to do in the criminal justice system. So we're putting together what we informally call toolkits or recipes that will show, look, if you have a local shooting by a local police officer of an unarmed civilian, how would you go about finding out if that's legit? You know, if we have a national database that we put together, we did a project about what books are banned in prison in states, can you take that data and use it in your own locality in a way that's actually relevant to your audience? And lots of people are doing it. The Trace is doing this with gun control. The 19th is doing it with the issues they cover. ProPublica has a data shop. But I think this idea, so we're going to do things like we'll have office hours where people can talk to our editors and reporters and we can give some advice. We're not going to be able to edit it. Okay, but we can disseminate some of the knowledge and expertise that we've gained. And then I'm going to move to the next idea, which, Emily talked about others, but, this, I just wanted to say, this was really great. This was part of Carrie's story where we collected individual stories of what happened to these women when we were criminalizing pregnancy. And it just blows your mind. It really does. And this is Investigate This. Now I was going to move to co-publishing with local. This is the story that David kindly referred to about a crazy system, and this was our story in Cleveland. So what did we want to do? We wanted to make sure it got in front of people. We were fortunate enough to co-publish this with the New York Times, but that isn't enough. We wanted to make sure that legislators saw it. So we co-published with New York Focus, who Akash you heard from, who's fabulous, and the Albany Times Union, because these are where people were going to see that these corrections officers were literally at some times getting away with murder, and no one was holding them to account. Similarly, and I think it's very important, we collaborated with a local TV station in Cleveland on this Driving While Black, which in what we informally called our ticket investigation. And I want to take a moment because we all know that broadcast news is how a lot of people in this country get news. And I think it's increasingly important to figure out how to get results of investigations onto TV. And also, broadcast news, I'm talking about criminal justice here, but there are a lot of other, is often not very well I'm trying to be tactful, but I'm not going to be tactful. They've been responsible for a lot of the, crime hysteria or stereotyping of people as criminals. The more you can do to give resources and spread more nuanced and deeper reporting, the more you have a chance of people seeing it. So I think, one of the things I would say is in addition to the Brattonall, we also did an investigation into police use of spit hoods, and we collaborated with a Tampa TV station. I think this is something we really have to think a lot about and if we want to reach people. I think that there's another theme that I really want to highlight, which is the idea that we need to think about different ways to tell stories. And we need to think really hard about some of our blind spots, how conventionally I think journalists wrote for journalists and hoping that the powerful would see it, but also didn't think enough about, who are we writing about and are we writing for them? And this, a lot of reason that trust in media declined is there were a number of groups from marginalized communities who are poor, who are black, who are brown, who were women, who didn't see themselves reflected in that reporting or saw themselves only treated as victims or criminals or whatever. And we didn't ask them, what do they want to know about? And what information do they need to be effective? And so I think there's a number of challenges there. One is that we have to find alternate ways to tell the story in ways that they will get, because you know what? A lot of people aren't going to sit down, as David mentioned, and read the 5,000-word story, as brilliantly written as it is. So this is one example, and Susie Cagle, who I think is here today, did this. We did a comic book that we called In Harm's Way, a full length, which was a look at how climate change affected a prison in California that was built in the middle of a floodplain, and we talked to incarcerated people who got no information about how flooding in California, they were terrified that they would be flooded out. And so we tried a comic book. I want to talk also about ProPublica, because I think they did an amazing project where they actually did a series about people with developmental disabilities and how they weren't being helped, and so they translated into plain language, right, which is actually a language. It's simplified sentence structure, but it is not something. It's not just using, it's not just using less convoluted words. It's really about thinking about shorter sentences, clear ideas in ways that will get that across to the people it was being written about. And I think that was extremely helpful. At the Marshall Project, we think a lot about people who are incarcerated and their families, and how do we understand what they want to read and what they actually need to navigate the criminal justice system. So one of the things we did, and I'll get back to some of these later, but Inside Story is our video series where we take our investigations and some of our work and make videos, and it's shown in hundreds of prisons now so that people can get our work in another way. We also have a print publication, but for people who in prison, there's very high rates of functional illiteracy. So you have to think about how do you reach people. So I'm not so good at coordinating the slides with this, but this was this wonderful illustration with the ProPublica story. This is Inside Story, our video series. There's another thing I wanted to talk about that is not a classic investigation, but I thought was very powerful. And so as we were preparing to open in Cleveland, thanks to Wesley Lowery, we got our hands on a database that tried to scrape every case and its outcome for a period of several years in the Cuyahoga County courts. And we wanted to be able to compare outcomes, see if we could see differences in race or gender or other things. So this became an ongoing project that we call Testify. But in the course of doing this work, we paired up with documenters, and I want to take a moment to talk about this institution because it's another way that we need to think about community. Documenters is a group of citizens who are trained to go to public meetings and write down what happens, because we don't have phalanxes of local reporters to go to these meetings anymore. And, the meetings are recorded, they're trained about how to be accurate, and documenters also will take on reporting projects where we work out questions and they go to people in the community and ask them questions. So when we were doing Testify, we said, what do you want to know about the justice system? They kept saying, who are the judges? We go in and we have no idea who they are, what their records are. Are they harsh sentencers? Aren't they? Well, we can't answer all the questions, but there was a year's work of work cleaning the data, and there was another year writing it, and in the third year, we started looking at, and this summarized investigation in kind of a comic, a kind of illustrated panel form, but we also did a guide where we put together everything we could learn, and we're filling it in as we continue our data analysis about each of the judges. Because we also found in this investigation that the very people whose lives were going to be most affected by judges' decisions were not voting for them, and they didn't have the information about who to vote for. So those are just some of the techniques and I think the ideas we have to consider as a profession. But I also want to talk about the issue of misinformation and the attempt to undermine democracy. And I talked to a number, as an editor, I don't get to do enough reporting, right? So I got on the phone, it was really fun, I love reporting. And I talked to a number of political scientists and people who study misinformation. And I wanted to highlight two really cool places, the News Literacy Project and Trusting News, but there are a lot of others that have looked into why do people not trust journalism among other institutions where trust has eroded. And I think one of the fundamental things, and I credit David Barstow when we were talking on the phone, I think it's really important that we recommit to some very fundamental principles. And one of them is report against your hypothesis, right? Investigative reporters understand that in order to have a bulletproof outcome, you have to aggressively understand where you might not be right. And I want to expand that into, you know, a lot of us have great passion, and I thought that the discussion yesterday with Nicole Hannah-Jones was really important because I think it is completely legit to come in and say, I see a wrong that I want to right. But the thing that we have to do is make sure that what we think we know or what we want to believe, that may not be sustained by the facts. And we have got to make sure that we challenge ourselves all the time not to slip into assumptions and report against our hypothesis. You know, it's sort of, I think that's really urgent because we all understand the temptation, but we've got to resist it. And one of the things that the scholars about combating misinformation said is that we have to be very transparent with an increasingly suspicious public. We have to write about and let them understand, how do we use sources? Why are we choosing the language we're choosing? What are our reasons and standards for granting anonymity? How do we protect people we report on? Not just sources who might lose their job, but vulnerable people who might be endangered by what we do or harmed in ways they didn't anticipate. And what is your commitment to remedying past harms that the news media has perpetuated on marginalized people? Like, how are we going to do better? Let's tell people. Let's be very clear. And I think that what I do want to say that I really believe, and it's not popular, is when Nicole said students say they want to go protest, you know, I get this, right? There's a lot going on in this world that is very distressing. But I am worried in an age of weaponization against the press that this makes us vulnerable. And that I believe that a journalist's job is actually to do the work to figure out what the harm is and expose it. And that if we do that, we will be in a much stronger position to retain people's trust and have our work be believed. And it will be something we can do. So I just want to say, please don't give people ammunition to hurt our profession. As much as we have passions, it's really important. Thank you for that. These two outlets have all kinds of tips on their websites about discussing misinformation, about what has shown to, you know, help wavering faith in democracy. But I will just say this: there's great exploration on their website. I encourage you to go and look. I want to talk a little bit more about both combating information and journalism and democracy. So these two outlets and other scholars I have consulted talk about, actually, there is hope about combating misinformation. It's really hard for all the emotional and psychological and political reasons I discussed, but the issue is you really have to be respectful in your approach to those who believe something that is factually untrue, and you have to be relentless in presenting the reality again and again. So these are not about the US, but one of the scholars I talked to talked about Mexico, and the president of Mexico, who has threatened not to respect the electoral process and comes from a country where there have been a great deal of zigs and zags about the commitment to democracy. So the president tried to undermine faith in the National Election Institute's reporting on election results, and I'll only say, sound familiar? So this guy, AMLO, said that the institute was corrupt, and a lot of Mexicans began to believe it was corrupt. But actually, as supporters of the institute started to put out articles and information about a detailed rebuttal, and they explained that in Mexico's history, election monitoring and independent institutes had been vital to Mexico's transition to democracy, and they did a sort of before and after study, and some people had come to accept this institution that was being denigrated as corrupt and untrustworthy. But the problem is, once doesn't do it. You have to keep at it. You know, it's a very, in misinformation has a very, very deep hold on people. And so you have to give them factual, calm rebuttals that present historical context, and you have to keep doing it. And that's a stepping stone to the thing that worries probably all of us the most, which is journalism and democracy, right? What do we do when there is actually a campaign in this country and around the world to destroy journalism as something that is able, as an institution is able to expose harm and hold the powerful to account? So we know that the first thing in the autocratic playbook is gut the press. Number one, we're watching it everywhere, and that is the thing you start doing. Hungary, Venezuela, Russia, China, the United States. And I would say that we know about the extreme examples where you kill journalists, or you imprison them, or you shut down, or you basically make, a government takeover of the press. But Hungary is a very important and chilling example of the gradual tightening of the noose. And essentially what happened there is supermajorities for Orban's party in the legislature passed a series of laws that exploited loopholes and made standards about the press that really made it possible to level crippling fines. And so people began to self-censor, And so what you really had was people were not tortured and they were not shut down. They pulled back and became utterly a reflection of government policy. So autocracy doesn't always have to win by extreme examples of repression. It can corrode people's ability to survive, and that happens when opposition parties and opposition sentiment are starved of resources and representation. And, this we're watching going on in horrifying ways, but I also do believe that there's so many examples where you can't quite extinguish this. And, just recently we saw with Navalny's death, the outpouring of a very terrorized public, but they showed up, right? They laid flowers at his grave. They went to his church service. They knew their faces would be recorded. You see it in Iran, where the killing of Mahsa Amini prompted remarkable demonstrations that were repressed, but they were there. So there is a sentiment. There is even in places that have become very autocratic, there are embers to be fanned. And I think that it's also really important to, when you look at other countries, one of the things that's really interesting is that both in Russia, one of Navalny's secret weapons were these big videos looking at corruption and wealth. That's a classic target for investigative journalism. And that eroded a lot of confidence among ordinary Russians. So, I think that we also can look at some success stories where the elections in Poland and in Senegal, where, after long periods of repression, unexpected victories were not. So we have to, I think the point here is not, and I'm not really urging a partisan approach, I'm urging that we keep advocating by doing the work that exposes things that enrage people. And you talked about narrative, you talked about visual storytelling. We have to reach people. We have to find a way to stir their hearts and their outrage. And so we have to use every single technique that we can. And that's why narrative and new forms of storytelling and new ways of thinking about how to reach people are so urgent for us. Because if we stay in the box, it's not going to resonate. And so I guess that I'm here to say it is really hard. I'm sure like many of you, I wake up in the morning, I don't know what thing to despair about first, right? It's like you pull out the phone and it's everything. But we cannot give up. We cannot give up because we're doing work that matters. And, we talk about impact, and Nicole Hannah-Jones said this. Right now my work is investigations on the criminal justice system. it's really hard to make change in this system, right? So, and we do have lots of impact at the Marshall Project, as many of you do. But nonetheless, I think we don't want to go crazy about, we can't control what will change. We can control what we expose. And I think we have to hold on to that. So what I would say is, try new things, really think about collaboration. Think about how, wherever you work, you can spread that work, and you can help others do that work. Think about how to get the work that we do in front of the people it affects the most directly, as well as the people who have the power to change it. Take chances, but please stay true to the values that served us well, even as we discard the practices that were not equitable or fair or just. And I want to say thank you for believing in what we do and doing it so well. And I'm happy to take questions. And if there aren't any, that's okay, because it's a long day and we've been tired, and that's all good.
I actually have one.
All right, David.
And it's actually about and I think it sort of gets at some of the themes that you've been talking about, which was the project Mauled.
Ah, yes.
Because as I understand it, you were pursuing this story on looking at canine dogs and the damage they've done.
You bet.
When suddenly along the way, you discovered that you were not alone.
I will tell the story.
And I just would love for you
This
to
is a
just
great
tell
story.
that story.
You know,
because
so Mauled, for which we were honored to win a Pulitzer Prize, and many of the people involved in that very story are sitting in this audience. I see you, Manuel. I see you, Leslie. This is what happened, and this is an example of how powerful. So we, in 2019, went to Montgomery, Alabama for our yearly retreat. And a wonderful investigative editor from AL.com in Alabama came up to Manuel Torres, because they were friends, and he said, you know, I have spent the last couple of years obsessively collecting videos about dog bites by police dogs that have mauled, wounded, and in very rare cases killed, but you know, severely injured all kinds of people. And obviously, let's get the resonance here. This is Alabama, 1960s, the way that dogs were sicked on civil rights protesters. And it's still going on routinely around the country. So Manuel came and said, you know, Challen approached me, and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. We have got to do this. I mean, forgive me, but that's about saying yes, right? That was an easy yes. So we said, let's figure out how we'll work with AL.com. So they brought us the idea, mind you, right? They brought us based on their local experience and the obsession of this guy. And we realized that what we could possibly do is try to establish a national look at what was happening across the country with the deployment and the rules, and surprise, no rules and no standards about how these dogs should be used and what the cases were. So Abby Van Sickle, who worked, you know, thanks kindly to David from the Berkeley offices of the J School and the Center for Investigative Reporting, started working on digging into the law files and uncovering. And then one day I was having a phone call with Catrice Hardy, who was at that time the executive editor of Indy Star. And we're chatting as we did, you know, kind of comparing notes. And I'm like, you know, Catrice, we're really excited about a project. She said, you know, yeah, our big project this year is about police dogs in Indianapolis. And I'm like, Catrice, that's our big project for the year. Let's join forces. Because we knew that Indianapolis, in fact, had some of the highest incidents in the country of these injuries. So Catrice is like, I'm in. And then this continued to grow. We found that the Invisible Institute was working with IndyStar about a database of policies and incidents. So we can find, so now we have AL.com, we have the Marshall Project, we have IndyStar, we have the Invisible Institute. And then later on, we joined with the Advocate in New Orleans because they were pursuing a story. And then this ended up being a more than 10-part series that, I mean, truly, honestly, I think we were all flabbergasted when it won the Pulitzer. Like, we didn't, but what I thought was really exciting about it is this is an example of what you do. And, like, you know, we could have, I guess Catrice and I could have put our heads down and say, well, I'll get mine out before hers. But you know what? No, because it was so much better when it had all the components, when we shared knowledge, when we worked with all the local reporters who had the sources in the police departments. So you're right, I should have thought of that. And I'll tell you, it was so exciting. And you know, in these newsrooms, when they got the prize, like you never want, I mean, my whole life I've been like, don't get too fixated on prizes. It's a nightmare. You can sit there and break your heart. You know, you can think what you've done is worthless, but it's very sweet when it does come. And it was so sweet, I think, not just for the Marshall Project, but for these newsrooms to be all part of this effort. It was a wonderful experience. And, you know, it's really hard doing partnerships with all these different people. And, you know, Manuel and Leslie and many other editors, we kind of kept growing and assigning more people and getting more people to do it and comparing versions and having to think about who was going to read it where. But that's how it gets more powerful. Yes.
Hello. Hi. Chris Ferrone from the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. And I just want to really thank you for the work that the Marshall Project does and for focusing on local. It's been great to hear that word over and over the past 2 days. And I wanted to point out yet another way that, not necessarily collaboration, but just that you help amplify our stuff and just a lot of other material from, you know, state level, municipal level, and that's through the newsletters, whether it's your newsletter, also the Appeal, a lot of you. And I wanted to take this opportunity just to say how important that is for us. You know, it's like this phenomenon in local news, obviously. Often it takes the Marshall Project to put it in their newsletter before the Globe cares about it. And it happens over and over, so thank you. I just want to see more and more of that, and it's been a great
yeah, I mean, that's a great point because we have this, you know, like many of us, we're doing newsletters, and we've always had opening statements, daily roundup, and we always want to flag investigations and relevant news around the country, so, you know, never hesitate. We will cite it if we can, and, you know, we've got to help each other.
I'm Jeff Kelly Lowenstein, founder and executive director of the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism, or CCIJ. Thank you very much for your presentation, and to all the other speakers and the organizers and the funders. Was just an absolutely incredible experience, so thank you. I really appreciated the point that you made around the role of emotion in the passing on of misinformation, and I wanted to get your thoughts about two things. One is, from my sense, combating misinformation is both working against the misinformation that's transmitted, but also working to create those trusted communities of accurate information, that people who hold on to that. And so I wanted to get your thoughts about the role of emotion in the second part, both of combating the misinformation. I understand the point about calm rebuttal, but addressing that emotional charge that people get. So might we think differently about how audiences receive and respond, not just the emotional outrage that you spoke to spur people to action, but in terms of the role of cultivating emotional connection in stimulating that community that leads to that trust in democracy and in facts.
No, I think that's exactly right. Thank you for making that point. I think that, you know, one of the things that I've learned a lot is that there are a lot of people, and it's not a political divide, who feel very alienated from the news media for lots of legitimate reasons, as well as the ones that I would think of are less legitimate. And so this idea of building trust, you know, reporters we heard presentations about the care that was taken to build trust with sources and to make sure that people felt comfortable trusting intimate, painful, sometimes horrifying experiences to journalists. And the trust that you have to do to make sure that people can believe that what you write, I mean, you know, what Wendy said about, I mean, I've been in newsrooms too, like, we're so exhausted just trying to get it done. Who has time to dream up some, you know, nefarious attempt to, you know, destroy the world or push a certain kind of view? But I think people don't believe that. And so I think that the emotional part is, obviously, a lot of what we write will anger even those who might generally, you know, like our work. And there's a very important line between listening to what a community wants. I'll quote a colleague of mine who runs Sahan Journal, which is a remarkable nonprofit that largely covers the Somali community in Minnesota. And, you know, he does a lot of community listening, but he also heard through that listening of a lot of corruption by some members of the community about how money was, and he felt that he had built up enough trust in that community and that this was truth and it was going to make powerful people uncomfortable, but they published it and they both got flack and praise. So I think it's really like there's no substitute for meticulous and slow and important accountability to your audience, but also a sense that we can't ignore something that's going to make you uncomfortable. We're not, you know, conspiring to hide something, right? That's my best answer. It's hard. This work is grueling. Barbara.
Hi, Susan. I'm Barbara Rabb. I'm with the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, and just full disclosure, we do support the Marshall Project.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for this kind of digest of all the reasons for hope, because we hear about them sometimes individually, and I hope you'll make this available, actually, because I think it's a nice list of all the things, and I hope that students here get some hope from that, too. I want to ask you, you have shown us a lot of examples today of reporting that leads to changes. And at the same time, I want to ask, I'm just curious your reaction to something that Nicole Hannah-Jones said yesterday, which really struck me and has stuck with me.
Yeah.
So I want to preface the question by saying that, if I recall correctly, when the Marshall Project was launched, there was a lot of energy around systemic criminal justice reform, specifically around mass incarceration.
Yep.
And you might disagree with me about this, but I also think it's probably fair to say that for a number of reasons, the energy that was around that has subsided, and in fact, one could even argue that we're seeing a big backlash against that.
Yeah.
And so I am wondering how, just your thinking around what Nicole said, which was, I know that the investigative reporting, I do, she said, is not going to change anything, because these systems that I'm exposing, that I'm bearing witness to, are designed basically to stay this way.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how you think about that in the context of your work right now.
Absolutely, and in fact, what Nicole said resonated very deeply with me. So I'll say a few things. Yes, I believe that the energy that had been building for a long time about criminal justice reform and revulsion about mass incarceration, which was remarkably bipartisan, and very rarely, because you could be someone who read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, or you could be a libertarian who worried about the state taking away rights, or you could be a fiscal conservative who thought that mass incarceration was actually, you know, financially crazy and could bankrupt us. So all those strands came together in a remarkable way, and in fact, since the pandemic, where you saw what is pretty clearly now a contained spike in crime rates, but that shifted a lot of the perceptions in a very seismic way, we see a backlash, and we see a shattering of any kind of bipartisan approach to criminal justice reform, although there remain people on the right and the left who both believe in it. So those things are true. And also, and I really love solutions journalism as an idea. I really believe that the public hankers for how to fix it. But we've talked about this at the Marshall Project. So what's the program or the little model that actually wipes out the racism that is so systemic in the criminal justice system and how it's administered? Like, what's the solution? And I'm not mocking it. I'm just saying, like, we don't want to pretend that it's easy to fix, right? And so I have always said, and I know that in investigative reporting, and even the decisions we make on what to choose, you ideally want to expose a harm and hope that prompts change. But I think that we can get obsessed with impact to the detriment of understanding the value of consistent exposure. Now, I know, like, maybe it won't change, but there may be small things that change, and there may be people who are roused to action, or there may be people who are disgusted, or people who think differently. I do think that we can run away with an obsession about demonstrable impact. And I would also say that the people who give prizes sometimes, I think, place an inordinate value on demonstrable impact, because some things are very deep-rooted in this country or this world. So yeah, we struggle with all that. And it's hard. And you don't want to feel that you wrote about something you consider to be an abuse and it didn't get fixed. But that is the world we live in, and we just have to keep at it. I remember talking to someone who was a political organizer, and I sort of asked them how they kept the faith in work that seemed very discouraging. And this person said, well, sometimes things have to get really, really bad before they change. Again, that's not necessarily true, but I think, you kind of have to take the long view, and you have to believe in the value of what you're doing. And you have to try. I do think I think journalism can reach some people. It doesn't mean it's going to change a law or it's going to wipe out systemic harms, but there may be some people whose lives get improved, or somebody who gets out or has their case looked at again. This has happened with Carrie's work and Joe's work. But I think it's a hard road, right? Definitely. Was that Emma? Right. Hi.
Hello, my name's Emma Garcia. I'm one of the J School students, and I'm also from Salinas, California, in case none of you guys caught that yesterday. I'm very passionate about local journalism. Before coming to J School, I had worked in like a broadcast news station, and so this question stems from my experience where, local news tends to be focused on trying to feed the information beast, right? Trying to turn over stories, and there's not always room for investigative journalism. And when you're at the bottom of the food chain in a newsroom, how do you push that? Especially since many of us will be at the bottom coming out of the J School.
Well, this is absolutely true. I mean, that's one reason why ProPublica has so often done the local reporting network and the Times fellowships, and we also, that's one reason when we do collaborations, and many other people here, is that we try to bring national resources to help so that it's not such a burden on a newsroom. But I know that it's really difficult because if you have diminished staffs and you have certain daily things that it is your mandate to cover, we all know they're expensive, they're time-consuming, the payoff is far off, and lots of investigations do not happen in under-resourced local newsrooms. So I think the answer is partly some things I tried to talk about, where you try to lend a hand and you try to make it easier, or you try to provide assets or help or support that is not present. Like when Challen came up to Manuel, with the permission and endorsement of his magnificent editor, Kellyanne, she gave him permission because she knew that she needed more editing help to pull this off. And so it was a completely open thing. And I think it's more like find potential partners and see if you can get resources for this so you can sell it to the people who need to give you permission to do it. I don't mean that should all fall on your head. I just mean like these are tactics. Because there's a lot of people out there in nonprofit and for-profit, I hope, who will be interested in this. Okay, so I think it's time to drink and eat. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you.